Everybody, we're doing another video at my daughter Rebecca's ranch, and I told them to remind me of some things, but I'll remember this part. I never make titles to my videos ahead of time. As you see, most of the times I make something up, from a joke or whatever. But today, because sometimes I have so many little notes I got to write, and after I make the video, that I said, well, just to keep order, this is probably one of the first times I made a title before. And I wrote it down, and I thought, the history of everything in 1 hour. Now, I might have to cut it shorter than an hour, but that just came to my mind. And then when I got here, I said, I was thinking of a funny title, and Rebecca said, I just started watching. What was it that you watched?
It's I guess the history of mankind on the History Channel.
Okay.
That's what it's called. And it's all like 10 episodes of everything from the beginning to the end.
And that's why I thought maybe we'll do that. I'll do a few quick updates. Lulu asked, because last week, those that watch videos, I said, I don't know, it seemed like, maybe Pastor Bill Cornelius, who's a good preacher, I said, I think he's maybe thinking about moving on, which is a lot of times in ministry, someday I'll talk about the various things about ministry. So Lou didn't hear the message, because I said, I think next Sunday, which was the Sunday that passed, I said, I think he might be going to make a big announcement. And now Lulu asked me when I got here. Oh, right away, she said, and what was it? And so this is a trick to get her to sit with me in the video. I said, look, I'm going to talk about it on the video, but I cannot reveal that secret to anybody else. But everybody that watched the video already knows, but I'll say it again. Bill, last week, said, next week, he said, it's going to be the most important message of the year. And when he said it, it was not like, it was almost, he wasn't kidding, but it was sort of in a way that I could just tell. It wasn't something you're excited about, like, next week I'm going to preach on it was sort of off the cuff at the end of his message. And I think he was going to maybe say there's going to be a change. But what happened was, this Sunday, Lou, he said, I'm going to preach something different than I didn't plan on preaching. And he just talked about the book of Daniel. And that actually makes me think I might have been right, because he changed the message. And then at the end, he also said, and I think a big part has to do with finances, and at the end of the message, he said, look, everybody that can chip in, chip in. And I'm not criticizing it. This is how I could kind of see that maybe these are. He said, even if you have to get 25 cents for the car, he wasn't begging. What he was trying to do was, I think a lot of the people are not giving. Okay, I give, but it's not a whole lot. But I do give. I write a check once a month for Bay Area. And he also mentioned that. He said, look, even if it's just a few dollars, even if you got to go to your car and get change, and I don't think he was scrounging for change. I think he was trying to instill the principle to just start, just for everybody to give something. That's what. Now, but I can't go long because I got to do the history of everything. I want to do a few updates. I mentioned the shooter Orlando in the last couple of videos, and I also, on the other video, I talked about, quote, conspiracies, about TWA Flight 800, about Tower 7, I mentioned it again. But what I meant and talked about, I said, there are times where the country, for various reasons, whoever's president, there are times where the country believes, for national security purposes, we're not going to say what really happened. TWA Flight 800, I don't want to do it all again. But it was kind of obvious that a surface-to-air missile shot that plane down over New York City back in 1996. It's quite obvious. But the official government report was the gas, there was an electrical short on the plane, it blew up the gas tank. But there were many witnesses that said, no, we saw a rocket hit the plane. And some of these witnesses were pilots, military men. So if you told a pilot and all these other witnesses, but they kind of there was a reason, I believe, that they just came up with that other story. But this last week, the air traffic controllers who were on duty that night finally came out and said, no, we had radar on the government came in, took our radar that night, the scans, something did indeed hit the plane. We saw it on radar, and the air traffic controller came out this week, just recently, and kind of spilled the beans on that. Now, the Orlando shooter, which Omar Mateen, I've been talking a little bit about it, and last night on the news, they've been interviewing a black girl who herself was shot in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub. And I saw that black girl being interviewed. Her name is Patience. Okay? I'm just remembering. I don't know. Maybe it was Carter. But her name was Patience. Okay? That was her first name. It's the black girl that got shot. Her interview was on all the world news the last 2 days. But last night I watched Democracy Now! News, which is a liberal news. They showed another part of the interview that none of the other news wanted to show. And she said when he was shooting, he said, even to her, he said, this is not against blacks. I'm not in here doing a hate crime. I'm in here doing this in retaliation for the United States bombing Afghanistan. Now, why would the other news people not want to say that last part? Okay? Now, right here, real time, you got another example of a particular reason why the government and the news organizations will work hand in hand, but Democracy Now! Is an independent news organization. So they will do, but they're legitimate, okay? I watched them for many years. They didn't want, I believe, that aspect to come out, because then it shows you it was a direct attack from somebody that believes our involvement or bombing in Afghanistan is wrong, okay? But it's whether, and also today on Talk Radio, as I make the video, already the news cycle online is the government's hiding the whole 911 tape. The girl called 911. The guy called 911. Now, the news organization's already made what's called an information request to get the 911 tape. Normally, when you do that, you get it. The government's classifying the 911 call, saying it's a matter of, domestic threat. We can't release it. Well, they just don't want people to know that that man was not just unstable, which he might have been, not just anti-gay, which he might have been. They don't want you to know that he was actually in there saying, this is not a hate crime. I am doing this in retaliation for the United States bombing of his home country. Though he was born in the U.S., he's from Afghanistan heritage. And he said that. And today, they're not releasing the 911 tapes, okay? So you already saw, even in the last few days, a whole nother conspiracy going on, but it's not a conspiracy. That's stuff I've been talking about. I'm trying to sit here to be out of the wind. So, let me see if I got another note. I'll update on, they wanted to open up a detention center in Alice. Now, it was for immigrants, or in San Diego, which is a little town right around here. Well, some of the local community were, basically, they weren't informed about it, then they were upset, and they were going to do a few meetings, and they decided that the company that was going to open it, I think Centrex or something, they said no, and they pulled out because the people wanted another town hall meeting and all. But Bishop Mulvey, who is the Catholic bishop of this whole diocese, Corpus Christi is a cathedral city, he wrote a letter against the detention center, and it probably had influence. Why did he write a letter against it? The Catholic Church believes that a lot of the immigrants that are actually in some of these detention centers now, which we have some here along the Texas-Mexico border, they believe that their human rights are violated by the women and children that are in these centers. and they're being held, and it's a big debate, and the Catholic Church is very pro-immigrant. So Bishop Mulvey's letter might have had an influence, and they're not going to open it up, which is good. I mean, at least the people had a voice. And I mentioned the Planned Parenthood thing a while ago. Real quick, there were two people, a younger man and an older woman, who are in a Christian group that is anti-abortion. I'm anti-abortion. Well, this last year you had, and I've talked about it, so I want you to see that I was right, okay? This last year you had these two anti-abortion people go to the Planned Parenthood in Houston, Texas. And they had them on videotape. These were real videotapes. They were not fake. And the media has said they were highly edited, okay? That's a trick. The only thing they edited was, it might have been 6 hours of discussions. And they edited when the people went to use the bathroom, came back. Everything on those Planned Parenthood videos was real, not fake. But because they wanted to spin it, they said highly edited. If I was here for 7 hours and Lulu got up and Becky that, and I said, well, I'm going to edit the video down to 1 hour just for the teaching, that's exactly what happened. They were not fake. And what was it on the videos that this conservative pro-life group got? They had discussions about that Planned Parenthood out of Houston selling the parts of the babies, okay? And they said, we'd like to get a kidney, we'd like to get a liver. They do sell those parts were being sold to an organ donation center. But the discussions, and they've been doing it for years, okay? After the Planned Parenthood did this video, they stopped doing it because on the video, the Christians that were pretending they were one of these organ groups started saying, man, we'd like to get, can we get this for $1,600 and this? And the Planned Parenthood people were saying, well, we'd like to bundle them if we can sell them in parts instead of whole. That was the discussion, and they got it on tape. It's illegal to sell body parts, and Planned Parenthood didn't know it was being recorded. Well, it caused a big firestorm in our country. Texas has said, we're going to sue you because it's illegal to... Now, the woman that is the district attorney in that area, her name is Devin Anderson, okay? Devin Anderson is a Republican woman, but she's very pro-Planned Parenthood. And she was even had a lady working in her prosecutor's office there in this area of Texas that is on the board of Planned Parenthood, okay? And Devin Anderson has also ruled in favor of Planned Parenthood and against the pro-life Christians before. It's not the first time. She has a history of kind of doing what she wants to do. Well, what she did, I could put them on, I'm not reading. What Devin Anderson did, who is the prosecutor, when these videos came out, she charged those two conservative Christian groups with the crime of trying to purchase body parts and felony crimes of false identification. Because when these Christian pro-life people went in to do these undercover videos, sort of like any news organization does, they made fake driver's licenses. So the Planned Parenthood would not know they were pro-life Christians, but well, they got them for fake drivers, and she charged them. Now, at the time, I said, that's a scam. I said, because that woman, Devin Anderson, the only way you would charge them with purchasing a body part is if you believe they really wanted to purchase them. But they didn't want to purchase them. They were just trying to expose that Planned Parenthood basically was selling them. And I said, she's targeting them. Yesterday in the paper, the judge in charge of that case, not Devin Anderson, if the woman was a good DA, she herself would have dropped the charges, because everybody knew those charges were just politically motivated. But the judge overseeing the case dropped one of the charges against the young man. Why? Because the law itself says you cannot bring a charge of someone trying to purchase body parts if it's purchased from a medical association for the purpose of like an organ donation, which is what they were pretending. The charge of purchasing a body part to charge someone, that does not apply to a person that is trying to get an organ from a medical association or Planned Parenthood for the purchase of organ donation. Now that woman, Devin Anderson, she knew that, but she charged anyway. And so the judge in the case basically said, yes, that lady prosecutor, she didn't even obey her own law and was forced to drop that charge. She didn't drop it, the judge did, proving that what I said, that woman was just out for spite, and she used her office in a way that is unjust. Okay? So that was yesterday. One of the charges was dropped, and it was for that reason, because she was doing it out of spite and politically. That was in the news. And what else do I have? I did Mateen, the bishop. Okay, the history of the world. I was going to do the $200 miracle. Maybe at the end, if you remind me, you'll like the story. Oh, it's a good story. You'll like it. Okay. History of the world, and the reason I thought about doing it, so I'm going to have to do it in 20 minutes, is because my daughter Debbie, I'm trying to get all of my kids in some of the videos. So I haven't had Debbie or Christina yet in the video. And Lulu's adoption papers are not finalized yet. No, I'm just kidding. Like, she's going to be adopted. So my other daughters, they're all concerned with animal rescue and all, but I figured this one's like a social justice group. The one at Bethany's is reviewing the Church Unlimited notes, and I want to do animals. So I was going to have Debbie out here, but she's helping with animals right now, and she couldn't come. That's actually what she's doing. And I figured, let's start with the creation. Let me ask this question. Now, you see these animals, that's Han. Han's like one of my favorites, little pit bull, and he plays when I can knock him. Where did they really come from? Where did they really come from? And when the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, and I'm going to do a brief overview of the history of the world and everything. In Genesis chapter 1, it says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it says, God spoke, let there be light. Okay? We read this story in Genesis 1. And then in 6 days, God, as he was creating things, one day, the stars and the light and the sun. And when you get to day 4, it says, God said, let the waters bring forth life. And that's where you get all of the fish and everything created. But you don't get the animals, okay? You don't get the animals yet, but you get the fish first. And then on day 5, God made man and animals on day 6. On day 5, he made the fish. I just wanted to mention those two. You could read all of the account. But he made the fish separately from man and animals. And even today, Becky, you took biology, didn't you? Man, a lot of Christians have a problem with this, but actually, what do they refer to man as? Biology. Okay, but animals are in a different category than fish. Okay?
Oh, yeah, well...
Okay.
Mammals.
Okay, mammals.
Yeah.
And do they include mammals? Are humans considered in the same category when they discuss it in biology?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah, because mammals separates out to
Yes.
several different animals. But yeah, humans are all on their own.
Yeah.
They're not considered anything related to anything other than monkeys, apes,
And the
hippos,
correct and the fish.
Yeah, fish are on their own category. I believe it's like amphibians and stuff like that.
Okay.
So,
And we find also in the biblical account that those categories are separate.
Yeah.
Okay. And in the biblical account, animals and man, they're different because man is In that account of Genesis, man is created in the image of God. In the physical, this is why, but this is why some, they see commonality, common features among humans, and particularly gorillas, apes. We've had some famous stories, I won't do it all. The child that fell at the zoo, and the gorilla they killed the gorilla at Big Bang the last month. But because you have common characteristics, there's a few things that people assume in the progress of time. I'll get to it. It's going to come up in the 1800s. Let me not do it right now. And I'm going to do it all in 20 minutes. We're going to be done. The account of creation is this. Everything we see came from something that spoke. Okay? And a lot of people think that is so unscientific. Okay. A lot of people for hundreds of years thought the same thing. This is one history of creation and of man. Well, there are other histories of this. All this took place in an area called the Garden of Eden. Is there an actual area of the world today, we were talking geography a minute ago, where this seems to have occurred, if you take it as historical narrative, meaning it's true? Yes, it's called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia would be the heart of what the Bible says is civilization, and where is that today? Basically Iraq, okay? Iraq would be the heart of it. It's right, you have the Middle East, you have Palestine, but Iraq would be the cradle of civilization according to this. There are other civilizations that existed and that have recordings of where everything came from. Some famous ones called the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are other writings that also record a great flood, which you get to in Genesis chapter 6. You have other histories that are told of the history of man, the history of everything. And the one in Genesis is different in this sense. Some of the other histories have certain things that are familiar, but some that are really, in the fairy tale category. And the Genesis account actually doesn't have any of the other real strange stuff to it. Okay? I can't do it all. I don't know all of them, but I know some of those other accounts. But could this be true? That in the beginning, something that was not material spoke and everything came into existence? Could that ever be scientifically proven? Because as far as we know, that story is about 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years ago, actually. Now, does it mean that there's not an argument for a very longer creation, the earth being older, the universe being older? It doesn't mean, but this account is about dated to that time. Okay, now, from that book, Genesis, from that story, you have a whole story in the history of humans. And I've taught a lot of this before. Abraham, David, God calling different people, speaking to them, telling them, I want you to do a certain thing. Okay, that's the history now we're getting of the Old Testament, and Genesis is the beginning. Now, as you go through the Bible, this last year I've been talking a lot about different books I'm reading in the Bible. You have the history of the nation of Israel, which are real people who trace their roots back to the story in the Old Testament of Genesis. That nation is a real nation existing today in their land of Israel, which we refer to sometimes as Palestine. And if you were to go and trace the history of the nation that's there today, and you went and traced their roots, it also goes all the way back to that time, to the history in the Old Testament, where there was a man by the name of Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had an actual son by the name of Jacob. And one day God changed the name of Jacob and said, your name is now Israel, which meant like prince with God, man. And that man, Israel, also had sons, and he had 12. and those were called the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Now, if you trace the history of the people that are living in Israel today, I'm not going to do all the different other views on it, but this is history. It goes back to that time. Okay, so how could that be true? Because it's recorded in there. It's true not just because it's written in the Bible. A lot of people are confused about the Bible. They say, how could you just believe something that's written in some book that has miracles? No. You can go trace history. You see, history of humanity exists not just in the Bible. You find it all over the place. Okay, that nation of Israel exists. And that's the primary history that you read about in the Bible. Now, covering the Old Testament story and going through all the things I've been teaching about, the people in those times had interactions with God. You had poets. We have the book of Psalms. You had wise men, philosophers. You have the book of Proverbs. You had all of the same types of things that people eventually advanced in. One area of history that we do not have, and I'm going to do a little bit of that right now, is right at the end of the last book of the Old Testament, which is called the prophet Malachi. You have about 400 years after the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament, which is Matthew. And in that 400-year history, that's the history of Alexander the Great, some important Jewish history, Maccabees wars, things that I've discussed. And during that time is when you had the rise of what the famous Greek philosophers, which the big ones I taught on were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. What did those philosophers, what were they dealing with? What were they challenging? They were looking for the purpose of everything. They even said, we're trying to find a unified reason why everything is. What's it all about? You had the development of science. Aristotle is often called, quote, the first scientist. Though we know him as a philosopher primarily, he's often referred to as the first scientist, the premier one. Now, let me ask this. Remember the account. Remember what I said. Did everything come from somebody that actually spoke? What did these people think? Where did the animals come from? Where did the stars come from? The philosophers started questioning these things just like anybody else. And the other cultures had their own history books that also said, okay, where did it all come from? Where did it all start? What we call creation accounts. The philosophers, which I taught a lot on this last couple of years, they tried to say, what's the motivating force for all of those things? Where did it come from? They dealt with motion, the movement of water, things of that nature. But they had a particular word. It's a Greek word. And they actually said, we're looking for, quote, the Logos, which is the word logos, which is a Greek word. They actually said that. This is before the time of Jesus. They said there has to be a principle that all of this is about. And in the New Testament, at the time of Jesus, he's referred to by that same word. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the writer who wrote that was the disciple John, the Apostle John. And he was telling those philosophers, we found the Logos. We found the answer and the Word. Now, what's significant about that? Jesus is called the Word. And how did everything come now? These guys were dealing with science. There was a man by the name of Ptolemy in the period between intertestamental period. This man was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy was a great cosmologist. He developed a system of the heavens and the planets that were a lot like what we have today. And a lot of people think everybody thought the world was flat until the time of Galileo and Copernicus, which I'm going to get to. We're going to do it all, and I'm going to be done in 20 minutes. No, they didn't believe the world was flat. 300 years, 200 years before Jesus Christ, one of Alexander the Great's generals, Alexander the Great, died, and that rule was divided. Seleucid, Ptolemy, this is the Greek Empire. And it was divided amongst 4 of his generals. This is actual history. And this history we do have in the Bible, but it's not. It was prophesied by the prophet, Daniel. I just told you that Pastor Bill preached on Daniel. But it was prophesied ahead of time. That's a great prophecy. Some people have been converted to Christianity because Daniel specifically prophesies the death of Alexander the Great and the division of Alexander the Great's kingdom amongst 4 of his generals. That's in the book of Daniel, and that was written over 100 years before that happened. That's in there. Some intellectuals got converted to Christianity just for that. But one of his generals, by the name of Ptolemy, he was a smart man. Alexander the Great, when he was doing these world-conquering things, it's been said that it was the most expensive scientific expedition up until the days of the NASA space program of the United States. Why? Because he had scientists, people collecting all types of things on these conquests he had. So those were smart guys. And one of the family line from the general was named Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And this man, just from the observation of things, developed almost an exact cosmos of planets and orbits, almost like we have today. The same amount of planets, he had one extra one. The same amount of everything orbiting around. This was 300, 200 years before Jesus. They didn't all think the earth was flat. It's the Ptolemaic view of the cosmos. Now, it wasn't exactly right, because the way he developed it was, if he had a globe here, and sort of like he had a globe, and it had like a glass, this would be the concept, it had like a glass sphere around it. And that's how they figured it out. They didn't know the difference between stars and planets, okay? They all thought these were these heavenly bodies. And why did they develop that? For agriculture, for seasons. And it worked. Now that system was developed a couple of hundred years before the time of Christ. And I've heard science people on TV say, people thought the earth was flat until the time of Galileo. Now how people could not know history and actually be teaching science, and that's a common thing. The earth wasn't flat under the Ptolemaic system. The thing, as time advanced, and we're going to now, you had, I don't know if I can do it all. It's going to be hard to do it all. But you had what we refer to, at the time of Christ and the Christian movement, you had the disciples, you had Jesus as the fulfillment of many of these promises that were made in the Old Testament. And he was that divine Logos, that Word. That's how he's referred to, the Word of God. And the promise was he would die and be raised again. Now, we have that account in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels of our Bibles. People used to also question, how do we know that's not all fake? Let me ask you, how do we know that anything is not fake? Over a process of time, we had, I'm going to jump a lot because I wanted to do Renaissance, okay, which is important. I wanted to do Reformation, 1300s, 1500s, but I'm going to jump all the way into the 1900s right now. We had something that was called the Industrial Revolution. You had it both in Europe and eventually we had one here. But what happened in the Industrial Revolution, there was a field of science, a new field that came up. And it came up as a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. Who knows what that new field of science is called? It's called archaeology. Archaeology came up as a field. Why? How did the Industrial Revolution lead to that? Because they started digging up. They started going into the ground to get precious metals for factories and industry and all. Well, when we started doing that, 1900s period, what happened? We found things in the ground. Some of the things we found in the ground, particularly in that part of the world, were things that were saying, oh, historically, we can look for certain things that other history books talk about, and if we find coins or things like that that was spoken about at the time of Christ and at the time of the Roman Empire, then we can verify from archaeology whether, yes, somebody told me, oh, I lived back at a certain day and a certain thing existed, and we say, I don't know if I could believe you. And then all of a sudden I'm digging something from the ground, and Becky said, oh, Dad, 100 years ago the people said there used to be a train that went through this neighborhood. And a lot of people said it, but we think it's a fairy tale. And then one day my daughter rents a backhoe and starts digging in the ground, and guess what? She finds a train track 20 feet down, and it has maybe the name of the railway that the people talked about. That's what archaeology did. So people that doubted whether the New Testament was real and the stories in the New Testament, guess what? They found out the history, even of the Old Testament and the New Testament, was verified through that new field, which is called archaeology. They started learning that it's not just a book with a bunch of stories. There was a famous man by the name of Sir Ramsay. And we also developed another field, and it was called document studies. How can you look at a document and verify that that document's true? Easy. If I said, oh, I lived out in a certain land, and there was a Whataburger and a McDonald's, there was an H-E-B, there was this, there's that, and you say, I don't know if I could believe you, John. I'm watching your YouTube video from New York, and you're in Texas. I said, oh, yes, but believe me, there's H-E-B, there's this. I don't know, he's making it up. And then, of course, if you came and visited and I showed you everything, okay? So this is what happened. Sir Ramsay was a man who they began questioning. All of the book of Acts is a historical document. It was written by Luke. And also the book of Luke was written by Luke, okay? You kind of attach those two. But Sir Ramsay learned this field of testing documents. And what he did in the 1900s, got it right, it's got to be 1900s, he began a research, yes, he began, the dog's barking?
Yeah.
He began go ahead, Becky.
Oh no, she just got to get it out of the room.
He began researching all of the names and dates in the book of Acts. Governors, streets, things like that. And when he looked historically at it, he found out that actually the cities, the towns, and all these governors and all were all true. This showed that history backed up what was written in the book of Acts, at least, and that the New Testament. And over a process of time, we've come to our day today. One other debate I wanted to hit on, the scientific revolution. We had various big movements that are important movements. You have what's called the Renaissance. You had the Reformation. You had the scientific revolution. I do want to mention it because I talk about this. I'm sure you've heard of Galileo. Okay? Galileo, this is why some people were confused on the whole flat Earth thing. Galileo, at the time, I want to do Renaissance, but I can't. I've done it before. But at the time of that period of world history, 1300s all the way 1700s, there were really great breakthroughs. And one is called the scientific revolution. And what Galileo did, and it's not called really the Galilean revolution, it's called the Copernican, from Copernicus. But this is what they found that made Ptolemy wrong. Galileo, we invented what's called telescopes, okay? Mm-hmm. And when you look in a telescope, for the first time, they had that back at the time of Galileo. And when you look at the telescope, what he noticed was this. Not that the Earth was round, or not flat, but it was round. Everybody knew it was round, okay? But what he noticed was this. This was the big debate that people are confused on. He said, everybody thought that our solar system, including our sun, everybody thought that it all went around the Earth, okay? Everything in our solar system went around the Earth. That's called geocentric. And a lot of people believe that, and the church believed that. Catholic Church believed that. But when Galileo and we started advancing scientifically, what he saw in the telescope was different. He saw that the Earth was not the center, okay, of our solar system. But what was the center of it? The sun. It's called heliocentricity, meaning everything goes around the sun. That was the Big Bang, okay? And the story that whether we know is true or not, but really this is the Copernican revolution, but it was Copernicus, Galileo, and a man by the name of Kepler. That this is how this discovery was made. But what did happen, this is why people are confused. When Galileo initially came up with his new finding, the church did condemn him and say, no, you're going against the Bible. Why would that be going against the Bible? There are verses in the Bible that talk about the rising and the setting of the sun. There are things like that people, not that they thought it was flat, but that's like the same. They thought the thing that was in motion would be the other things, not the Earth, because of the sunrise and sunset. We call that phenomenological language in the field of theology and scholarship, simply meaning this. If a weatherman were to say, the sun's going to come up in the morning, the sun's going to set as the sunrise, everybody that watches that weatherman knows he's not giving you a scientific explanation. He's telling you the way things seem to appear to us. And so that language in Scripture is used at times. And that's what happened. But that was the big debate. Now, I'm going to end it with this. The process of time, we had a lot of breakthroughs. Because we were going to start with animals, that silly account that some people think was so fake. For all of these years of the development of science, the history of humans, man, there was another debate out of the many, and the debate was, where did it all come from? We know that the Bible said, and some people mocked it, but we know that the Bible said, in the beginning, God created, and he said, he spoke. There were some famous men by the name of Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine and others, St. Anselm, all through this history. And they debated among scientists. Most scientists believe this. Everything that's out there, everything that we saw, everything that we could look at, most believed it was always there, okay? Meaning everything in matter, the material world, always existed, was always there. Everybody didn't believe that, but most believed that. So the story in the Bible that God spoke it, meaning it had a starting point, that story seemed kind of fake, just from science, okay? But over time, in the 1900s, we had some of the greatest scientific breakthroughs that you would ever have, from a man by the name of Albert Einstein, people I cover a lot. And what Einstein and what we learned in the last century, okay, in the 1900s, there was a breakthrough. And now some people are critical of the way we describe it. But this scientific breakthrough is called the Big Bang Theory. And the Big Bang Theory simply said this. Einstein and others, as they were examining, advancing in knowledge, we had things called background radiation. And there was a Catholic scientist who really was the one who showed us. He was the real guy who made the breakthrough of the Big Bang. But Einstein played a role. And what science figured out was this. There was a time where everything started. Now look, that sounded silly when the Bible said that. That sounded silly to many scientists who were debating these issues for many years. But when Einstein showed, and also the other scientists, that there was a time where everything started, what that meant was there was a beginning point. And that meant that there was a time where nothing was. If there was a time where it all began, I couldn't do everything on how he showed us this. But what that showed, and this was a great breakthrough in the last century, that showed that those words in Genesis were true. How, John? There are atheists today, some famous ones. One is like this for me, somebody. There were famous atheists that are scientific, okay, that are smart, and when this truth came out, which we call the Big Bang, they had a problem with this. Because if there was a time where nothing was, none of that, no animals, no humans, nothing, how could it be now? How could you have anything now if there was a time where nothing existed? How could there be anything? If there was nothing out there, nothing, and you said over a period of millions and millions and millions of years, there became something, that is scientifically impossible. And the average person today believes that. The average person today believes that there was no cause for the effect of what is here. The average person is believing that somehow science tells us that everything came from nothing. That is a scientific impossibility. It's a violation of the law of cause and effect. You could not ever have nothing and then later from that have something. Never can happen. Science does not teach that, and a lot of people are confused on that. What does the Big Bang show us? The Big Bang shows us this. There was a time where there was no creation, nothing, but there was God, or there was something that had to be able to create everything out of non-matter. But that's what we read in the beginning. God, the Bible says, is a spirit. He's non-matter. God had no beginning. By the law of logic, whoever was responsible for all of this is science, had to be non-material. And the scripture, the Bible actually said God is a spirit. He was non-material. And the only cause for everything you have, scientifically, has to be God. There's no other scientific explanation. People are confused on that because they actually think that, now remember, we didn't always know that there was a time where there was nothing. We didn't always know that. But now we know. That's called the beginning point. That's called the point of singularity. And so by science itself, there has to be a cause. And that cause himself has to be what we call causeless. Now, I'll give one example to show you what a big blow this was to the atheist. There was a physicist, he's alive today, he's very popular, his name is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins knows what I just told you. All of the atheists that are scientists knew that when this became true in science, then they would lose the argument that there was no God. They knew that. There was some that said at the time, if the Big Bang Theory is true, we lose. But it is true. It is true. So Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, who understands that there was a time where there was nothing, they interviewed him once. because he still insists that there is no God, as far as I know, unless he got converted recently. There was a smarter man than Richard Dawkins from Britain. His name was Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew was also along the same lines as Richard Dawkins, very smart man. And at the end of Anthony Flew's life, he passed away. He became a believer. He said at the end, we can't keep fighting this particular argument. We can't keep fighting it, because he knew scientifically everything couldn't have come from nothing. Something else had to do it, and everything didn't always exist. And this was the advance of science. And they interviewed Richard Dawkins one day. They said, "Okay, you admit you don't believe in God," and he said, "Correct, but you also admit that everything wasn't always here. The universe, the stars, it wasn't always here." He said, "That's right." They said, "So you also admit that something else had to do this, correct?" And he said, "Yes." They said, "Well, what do you think did it, Mr. Dawkins? Do you think maybe there was some alien, that some other alien from somewhere?" And Dawkins said, "Well, that's possible." They said, "But if this alien did all this, do you think he's smart or stupid?" And Richard Dawkins said, "Well, that alien would have to be real smart, I'd assume, and powerful, and he'd have to be able to..." Richard Dawkins described the characteristics of God, but he simply called him an alien, because he knew that in the beginning, something created the heavens and the earth, because science showed us that everything had a beginning point. And in the history of development, I couldn't do everything I wanted to do, but in the history of development of man, we've come to a time, scientifically, where the most advanced minds who are rejecting God are trying to blame it all on an alien. Why would they do that? Because they know something started all this. And the actual account in Genesis 1 is not only a religious belief, it's a scientific fact. Because everything started with something that was not material, which is a description of God. And he spoke it. He spoke it. And Pastor Bill said last week that we found out that the most basic particle of man is a sound wave, or a sound particle. Science, understanding all of the things we've come to know to the point we're at today, at the end of the little animal thing, because it started with an animal, a dog, because Debbie, I thought, was going to be here. Where did it come from? It came from God. And saying that, the average person thinks is a silly belief in a book full of fables. No, it's a scientific reality that the only option is that. Or you could go with the atheist alien, because you cannot say it all came from nothing. That's impossible. But it all came from something, and that something had to be around forever. Because if that something himself wasn't around forever, then who started him? But it's not a violation of the law of logic or science for something to be forever. It's not a violation. We used to think it was the universe. See, people that argued against God for all those centuries, their easy argument was there is no God, but this universe is God, meaning it's always been here. Well, science disproved that already. Science has shown us it's not always been here. Science has shown us that there was what's called a point of singularity. And the brightest minds in science, including Einstein, have shown us the necessity for God. And that, as silly as that sounds, that account, that God spoke it into existence, all these years later, that's what we've come to the conclusion, that God spoke it, okay? That it came from an infinite being with all power who simply spoke it. That's the end of the history. I couldn't do Renaissance, which we'd have done about the 1300s, which was great. I've done the Reformation, which is 1500s, and then we did a little scientific revolution. But the whole history of man, it's not just about, I had a friend ask me once, he said, John, say if we find out one day that the Bible is just a bunch of stories. I said, the Bible is not the only proof of God. I said, everything's the proof of God. The history of humanity is the proof of God. C.S. Lewis, he was a great writer who's died years ago. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia and all those children's books, but he was an intellect, he was a smart guy. He too was an atheist. He didn't believe in God like Richard Dawkins and others. But you know, C.S. Lewis was smart. He read poetry, he read romance, he read science, he read history. And C.S. Lewis said everywhere he looked, the influence of God and Christianity was everywhere. And he said he could not deny it anymore. And eventually he became a Christian, a famous Christian. It's a great story, the story of C.S. Lewis. And so people today are under somewhat of a delusion. It says in the New Testament, because they didn't want to believe the truth, they believe a lie. There's a lot of people out there that are confused on all of this, and they're thinking there's some other explanation for all of this, and there is not. And in the end, Christ was the answer, and is the answer, because he was that word. He was that logos. The philosophers 200 years before him were looking for that. They even used that exact word. We're looking for the logos, the Logos. And in the New Testament, John says, that's him. That's the name used for Jesus, the Word of God. So it would be, some people say if it was just all a trick or all a scheme. How could you scheme all that up? How could you write a book and have an account that happened 6,000 years ago, and over time, people that didn't want to believe it, history and science proved it out? How could you figure out a plan like that? One other historical evidence, and we'll end it on that. Some people say, but how do we know Jesus was raised from the dead, besides the Bible telling us that? We have history that tells us the early followers of Jesus who believed that story went to their death, believing that story, that he was risen and they seen him. Psychology tells us that people might die for a false religious belief. Just had the militant Muslim shooting in Orlando. They might believe something that might not be true, but they sincerely believe it's true. So how does that differ from Christianity? The early disciples were not dying because they believed Jesus died and went to heaven. That could have been a belief they had. That was a belief. They were dying because they believed he was risen from the dead. That's different. So those witnesses had to be telling the truth, because if they were making it up and they were all dying for that belief, psychology tells us at the last moment you wouldn't die for a lie. You might be deceived in a religious belief, but you would not die for a lie. And what were those early Christians dying for? They were dying for the belief that they saw him, that he was risen. And that's different than saying maybe a Muslim who died because he believed in that might be a true belief they hold, but Christianity is a historical basis that Christ rose from the dead. So that's another way that we show that it was true. I think I did it in an hour, okay? I had some great history books over the years. Will Durant. I like Will Durant, a lot of history. But Christianity's involved, God's involved in all the history of everything. And in the beginning, he made everything. Becky, you want to say anything at the end? Do we have any? That's where the doggies came from.
Yeah.
Oh, and one last note. Some people ask me, after all of that, they say, will dogs go to heaven? There was even a famous movie about it. And I used to tell them, I said, well, some of them will, but if you want to also embrace that, that means the ones that were bad, you know where they're going. Well, I used to say that to Debbie. Like, the rattlesnake bite, hon, and you're going to hell, brother. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. in the new creation, we do believe everything will be there, because there'll be a new heavens and new earth. And the creation itself is going to be redone. That's redemption. It's going to be, everything is going to be renewed. But creation is from God. And matter is God made. All right, we're going to end with that.